Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. We're up to about 200 people. So first of all, I would like to welcome you to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. I am Tawandra Rao Kunsalo, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm happy that you were able to join us for this breakout session entitled Building an Abolitionist Presence as Social Workers. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but I'd like to start by again sharing our university's land acknowledgement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place where their nation has called Tejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. I also like to let you know that this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. And before I introduce our three speakers, I'd like to mention a few Zoom information items. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email address. This allows us to log our attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation, for those interested, which will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted for the duration of this presentation. Please use the Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenters. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we will not be able to get all questions answered. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our three presenters for this breakout session, and I will introduce them to you in the order that they will appear. You will first hear from Dr. Sophia Sarantakos, followed by Dr. Kristen Brock-Petroshius, and our final presenter will be Dr. Kirk or Jay James. He will close out today's presentations. Just for brief introductions, the first presenter, as I mentioned, is Dr. Sophia Sarantakos. Dr. Sarantakos is an assistant professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work and a community organizer. Their research, writing, and organizing are focused on how the field of professionalized social change work can be captured and shaped into a tool in service of an abolitionist horizon. As part of their organizing work, Dr. Sarantakos co-created the Abolitionist Social Change Collective, a virtual space for people engaged in all forms of paid and unpaid social change work to build a community that exchanges ideas and develops abolition-focused collaborations, advance non-carceral approaches to harm, accountability, and well-being, and work toward a more solidarity-focused form of social change work. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Sarantakos was a social work practitioner for 10 years. The second presenter, Dr. Kristen Brock-Petroshius, is an assistant professor of social welfare at Stony Brook University in New York. She is a community organizing scholar and practitioner studying methods to increase support for racial and social justice policies, including abolitionist policies. She has an interdisciplinary background with extensive training in the race, ethnicity, and politics subfield of political science and an anti-racist research agenda focused on building knowledge to inform macro social work practice. Kristen's organizing homes include Showing Up for Racial Justice, White People for Black Lives, and the Reform LA Jail's Measure Our Ballot initiative. She is a University of Wisconsin alum and first learned how to organize through work with immigrants and refugees, LGBTQ youth, and unhoused communities in Madison, Wisconsin. Our final presenter is Dr. Kirk or Jay James. Dr. James or Jay is an immigrant, formerly incarcerated Black man committed to creating a world in which everyone can self-actualize. Jay received his doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. He has utilized the content from his research and his lived experience to consult, coach, and develop educational content for the University of Pennsylvania, Temple University, City College, Fordham University, York College, and Columbia University, just to name a few institutions. Jay is currently the interim director of the DSW program at the NYU Silver School of Social Work and the chair of the Diversity, Race, Oppression, and Privilege, or DROP curricula area, and sits on the editorial board of Abolitionist Perspectives in Social Work. Jay speaks internationally on issues related to mass incarceration, anti-oppression oppression, human rights, and liberatory pedagogy. He is also completing his first book titled 94A6325, Coming of Age in the Era of Mass Incarceration, which is a reflection of his lived experience and research within carceral systems. So the way that I'll organize this session is that we will hear from each of the presenters and then have time for Q&A at the end of the final presentation. This will ensure that everyone is given the full time allotted for their presentations. Each presenter will speak for approximately 20 minutes, so that will give us plenty of time to have a very lively discussion at the end. So first up is Dr. Sarantakos. I think you can queue up your slides now.
Great, thank you so much. Before I do that, I just wanted to say hello again. My name is Sophia Sarantakos, pronouns are she, they, and also say that I'm a 41-year-old white ungendered person with brown shoulder length hair and brown eyes, and I'm wearing a black tank top and a black and white striped cardigan. Super excited to be here today. I want to thank Dr. Tawandra Roll-Consolo for inviting me. Really excited to share space with Kristen and Jay, and to learn from them, and also to be with all of you and learn from all of you. So before I bring up my slides real quick, I just want to say, if we're going to talk about bringing an abolitionist presence into social work, we first have to kind of ground ourselves in what abolitionist theory is. So that's my role today, is just to kind of give a quick primer on that. So I'll go ahead and bring up my slides. Great. Okay, so we're going to talk about prison industrial complex abolition, which is a change theory, a theory of organizing, and it offers us so much about how we understand the world. But before we even get into the kind of tenets of prison industrial complex abolition, we need to kind of break down the components first. So I first want to jump into what we mean when we say prison industrial complex. And for the remainder of the presentation, I'll likely say PIC for short. So, some people engaging in abolitionist praxis might say the word prison abolition, or they might say carceral abolition. I personally like PIC abolition because of what the concept prison industrial complex offers us in terms of an analytical tool. And the abolitionist organization Critical Resistance defines the PIC as a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And so what this concept really guides us toward is a much more extensive understanding of the depth, the intentionality, and the scaffolding that's supporting our punishment society, not system. It's a punishment society. It's not an isolated system. So in other words, what we understand as our criminal justice system is not merely a fixture within our economic, social, and political landscapes, but it's actually a core driver of those landscapes. And just a kind of quick historical note about the concept and the idea of a quote unquote industrial complex, that can be traced back to Dwight D. Eisenhower. And in his 1961 farewell address, he actually warned that, and this is a quote from his address, that the wide-scale and intricate connection between the military and warfare industry would determine the course of economic development and political decision-making for the country, to the detriment of all other sectors and ideas. And so essentially, Eisenhower was this sparked the term military industrial complex, which a lot of folks might be much more familiar with, and what the PIC is modeled after. And Eisenhower was actually really sounding the alarm about the US's commitment to war and death-making industries like weapons manufacturers, and how this commitment, if gone uninterrupted, would actually shape the direction of the country and its resources. And so prison industrial complex abolitionists thought, oh, well, this concept fits perfectly with the analysis that abolitionists were building, which is that they understood that the carceral and punitive logics that governed our legal punishment system actually extended far beyond that system, and that they, in fact, governed our entire cultural landscape and shaped how economic, social, and political issues are addressed. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more here with this visual depiction of the PIC. And this tool was created by Dr. Melissa Birch, who's a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan. She also organizes with Critical Resistance. And I really like this example here because it helps us understand that the PIC isn't some distant abstract thing. It's actually a set of relationships among living, breathing people across a multitude of sectors who all have a vested interest in maintaining a society and culture focused on surveillance, criminalization, and punishment. So in the diagram, we see this depiction, and this, of course, is not an exhaustive list of all of the components of the PIC, but it does help us kind of uncover these complex relationships. So what this depiction invites us to do is start at the very bottom, that first circle, and it says that the PIC is driven by vested interests of people like politicians, investors, prison guard unions, and it uses the tools of surveillance, borders, media database, the courts, as a response to social, economic, and political problems like addiction, unemployment, interpersonal violence, houselessness, to accomplish these objectives, which are to eliminate unwanted populations, to uphold dominant norms, to squash political resistance. And it targets and affects low-income people, youth, political dissenters, some immigrants, gender nonconforming people. And it's upheld by the systems and belief that create the weather system of our entire landscapes, right? So xenophobia, patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, settler colonialism, and it produces poverty, violence, environmental degradation, ill health, and death. And so what this is really telling us, right, this concept invites us to stop looking at these singular puzzle pieces of policing, courts, jails, prisons, and other detention facilities, and instead look at the entire puzzle, the entire context in which these institutions exist and are supported. And when we talk about PIC abolition, then we're talking about disrupting these relationships and practices on all levels, micro, meso, macro, which form a huge part of our country's foundation. And we're talking about building entirely new relationships and practices that don't center surveillance, criminalization, and punishment. So that's the kind of PIC component. Now, if we move into prison industrial complex abolition defined, we'll move into, I'm going to use this definition by Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie from their new book, No More Police. And I really like this definition. Here they say PIC abolition is rooted in the Black radical tradition and the lived experiences of criminalized people and communities. PIC abolition is a structural analysis of oppression, a political vision of a restructured society, a theory of social life or how we relate to one another, and a practical organizing strategy. And there are lots of really great definitions out there of PIC abolition, and I chose this one because it offers, I think, many of the components that I find most important to be clear about when working to understand PIC abolition. So first, it names where the theory and praxis comes from, which is the Black radical tradition and the lived experiences of criminalized people. It highlights that it analyzes oppression through a structural lens and provides insights into how society can and should be restructured if we truly care about all living creatures, the land, and building a future where both of those things are thriving. It makes sure to name that abolition also includes how we relate to one another on the micro scale. And then lastly, it actually points out that abolition provides us with a vision for how we can impact the world in real time through community organizing. And so for the remainder of the presentation, for the next 5 slides or so, I'm going to expand a bit on each of these areas mentioned in Kaba's and Ritchie's definition. So the first one, right, grounding it in the idea that it is rooted in the Black radical tradition and among criminalized folks. Kaba and Ritchie, are sure to say that because they want us to know that it did not come out of the academy and to know the true roots of where it came from. It came from Black radicals and people and communities who experienced this country's targeted criminalization practices firsthand. And so I only have 20 minutes. This is a very rich history and very important history, but I'll be naming key thinkers and organizers from the modern prison industrial complex abolition movement from the 60s onward. But I do want to say that this theory and praxis has roots in enslaved people's fight against chattel slavery, as well as Du Bois's work, particularly in Black Reconstruction and his idea of abolition democracy. So abolition is so far from new, and it was not born in 2020. It is a theory and praxis with roots that are over 100 years old. But in the interest of time, I'll be kind of focusing from the 60s onward. And I'm going to name 2 key modern PIC abolitionist theorists, criminalized Black radicals who brought so much to the work and continue to bring so much to the work through their analysis and writing. And the first is George Jackson. George Jackson is, when he was 20 years old, he was convicted of stealing $70 at gunpoint from a gas station, and he was sentenced to 1 year to life. While he was inside doing time, he studied with other incarcerated people. He was reading Marxist and Maoist and other revolutionary texts. And he began to really make sense of things that he was experiencing as a Black man in the United States. And he was also engaged in organizing on the inside and became viewed as a threat to the establishment because of that organizing and the writings that he was sending to the outside world. And just for some further context, 9 years into his sentence, he was falsely accused of killing a white correctional officer. And 1 year later, he was murdered by prison guards, and he was 30 years old when that happened. The quote on this slide is from a book called Soul Dad Brother, which you can see the cover here. It's a collection of letters he wrote while he was incarcerated. And the one quoted here is a letter to his mother. And in it, he writes, "I don't blame you for not teaching me how to get what I wanted without getting put in jail. Nor do I blame myself. I was born knowing nothing and am a product of my total surroundings. I blame the capitalistic dog, the imperialistic cave-dwelling brute that kidnapped us, pulling the rug from under us, made us a caste within his society with no vertical economic mobility. As soon as all this became clear to me that we were defeated in war and are now captives, I immediately became relaxed, always expecting the worst, and started working on the remedy." And I chose this quote for a lot of reasons, but to me, it highlights so much of Jackson's work, which is that he's helping people on the outside make very, very strong connections between the intentionality of the structures that shape our world and how they're designed to be detrimental to marginalized communities, particularly Black people. And really understanding the acts of criminalization, incarceration, how targeted it is, and the fact that it actually is class and race warfare. And it is likened to warfare in so much of his writings. And in this quote, he talks about how we don't live in a democracy or a meritocracy. It's by no fault of his own that he couldn't make ends meet. Because as Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's another abolitionist thinker, says, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it, right? So all of these systems have a very clear intentionality to them, which is what George Jackson and so many other Black radical thinkers were trying to help folks understand and mobilize with that understanding. The second Black radical theorist I want to uplift is Assata Shakur. And Shakur was a Black Panther activist and Black Liberation Army member. And on May 2nd, 1973, she was pulled over by the New Jersey State Police. She was shot twice and then charged with murder of a state trooper. Shakur spent 6.5 years incarcerated before escaping out of the maximum security wing of the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey in 1979. And she fled to Cuba, where she received political asylum, and that's where Shakur is today. This autobiography, you see the cover here for it, came out in 1987, and it's deeply informed and inspired the modern day abolitionist movement. The book is really stunning and really powerful, and it toggles between her life as a young Black girl growing up in New York City and North Carolina and her experiences with that, as well as with incarceration and with her trial. And this quote is really powerful to me because it so thoroughly problematizes the state's definition of criminal. And I'll read it for you here. They call us thieves and bandits. They say that we steal, but it was not we who stole millions of Black people from the continent of Africa. They call us thieves, yet it is not we who rip off billions of dollars every year through tax evasions, illegal price fixing, embezzlement, consumer fraud, bribes, kickbacks, and swindles. They call us thieves, but we did not rob and murder millions of Indians by ripping off their homeland, then call ourselves pioneers. The rulers of this country and their flunkies have committed some of the most brutal, vicious crimes in history. They are the bandits, they are the murderers, and they should be treated as such. And I just think this is such an important analysis, and what abolition offers is that the idea of the criminal is socially constructed, and it's designed by people in power, and it's a category with great political utility. And by no mistake, it always seems to leave out the people in power who engage in the most horrific acts against humanity. And we're actually living through a perfect example of what Shakur is calling out here, right, in this moment, right? We have a president who is ideologically, financially, and militarily supporting the genocide of Palestinian people. And so much of what Jackson and Shakur and other Black radicals are asking is, where is the condemnation and accountability for the people in power who engage in mass killing? How can we actually believe we live in a democracy when the so-called democracy was founded in slavery and genocide? And so these are just two examples of criminalized Black radical thinkers who helped shape PIC abolition theory and praxis, and gave it its structural analysis. The next piece I want to get into is Kaba and Ritchie's point about it being a political vision of a restructured society. So some or all of you have likely heard and maybe even know a great deal about the defund the police movement that was kind of resparked in the summer of 2020. But this divest invest strategy is not new. And this is part of what we talk about when we say a political vision of a restructured society. This invest divest strategy, these calls have been made before, and these strategies are tied to Black radical organizing from decades ago. And in fact, we can actually look to Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King, and their work, because it very poignantly described the divest invest strategy. They were questioning our military budgets and questioning where our priorities were as a country. And if we just look at some numbers right now from the United States, right, in fiscal year 2024, the Department of Defense has $1.54 trillion distributed among its 6 subcomponents. This means $1.54 trillion allocated to war and death making. And then the US spends over $115 billion each year on policing. And that number has almost tripled since the 1970s. And most recently, we have Biden bypassing Congress to send more money and weaponry to Israel, who's actively committing a genocide. And so part of what abolitionism is pushing us to think through is, where we send our money, what our policies show our values. And so what, I think we all know, if most of us here are social workers, when we ask, where is the money for education, universal basic income, where is housing for all, where is universal health care, right? The common thing that people in power say is, well, how do you expect us to pay for that? And our retort should always be, well, you always seem to have money for death making, but never enough for the institution and policies that affirm life. And that's what this is about. This restructuring and this divest invest strategy is about. It guides us to demand that money be taken away from the institutions and systems that for decades now have shown that they do not bring about safety and healing. They actually create more death making. And that we should actually instead funnel those resources to the things we know help people survive and thrive, like education, like physical and mental health care, community and recreational spaces, and so on. And so PIC abolition is actually a very clear-eyed public investment strategy, The next piece I just want to spend some time on is how we relate to one another. Part of what Miriam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie talked about is that micro scale intervention. And these are just 2 beautiful pieces of art by this incredible artist, Molly Costello, where she says, we are having to unlearn generations of teachings that taught us how to dehumanize and encouraged us to prioritize punishment. And part of what we have to really investigate if we really want to engage in an abolitionist praxis in our daily lives is understanding, how are we engaging with each other? Are we policing each other? Are we on Nextdoor writing harmful things about our neighbors and calling the police for things that could be dealt with by just walking over and actually meeting our neighbors and being in community with each other? How are we with our partners? Are we, and our friends and our colleagues, are we stepping into accountability and understanding it as a gift and an opportunity for a deepening of a relationship instead of it being this frightening, punishing mechanism? How are we really pushing ourselves on the individual level in our relationships to move away from punitiveness, from even criminalization, and from surveillance of our neighbors, and really kind of understanding that we need this kind of a forging of deeper connections and relationships with each other. It's not just at the meso and macro scale, it's also at the micro scale. And then finally, I wanted to introduce, because they talk about abolition being a very clear-eyed organizing strategy, I wanted to offer a particular framework from the abolitionist organization Critical Resistance. And abolition offers us a vision for how we can organize ourselves and work to remake our economic, social, and political landscape. And so this specific framework here that I've shown is called Dismantle, Change, Build. And it's from Critical Resistance. And one is not privileged over the other. This isn't linear in any way. All three of these are engaged at all times. And, you know, the first one we'll dive into quickly is dismantle. And this is likely the one that most people associate with PIC abolition, and it involves developing long-term campaigns and sustained projects that focus on very particular cogs in the prison industrial complex. So we can think of the work of Upend Movement and JMAC for Families and all these other organizations that are trying to kind of pull apart family policing and what we know as the child welfare system, or the defund the police movement, right? And trying to really take money away from that institution and greatly weaken it. So we're trying to successfully weaken and break down those components so that the overall PIC is weakened. When we talk about the change component, change involves a few different pieces, right? And it involves changing how people individually and collectively think about safety, relationships, and harm and well-being. And that might mean really interrogating our own practices, like I just mentioned in the slide before, interrogating how we function in our relationships, maybe engaging in reading groups and political ed groups with our friends and our colleagues to try to learn more and interrogate more deeply with each other. It also involves changing the conditions of the landscape so that more organizing wins are possible. And so this is actually related to what I think Kristen will be maybe talking about later in terms of deep canvassing and organizing communities to support policies that reduce harm to marginalized communities and shrink the PIC, and instead strengthen the resources that actually keep communities safe and healthy. The last piece about change is also kind of changing who gets to be the narrator and who is deemed an expert, right? And it's, you know, it's the idea that we're not just turning to the Vera Institute of Justice or the Bureau of Justice or academic researchers, but that we're sure to uplift people like Assata Shakur, George Jackson, and so many others who are actually very important theorists and academics, regardless of whatever their education, formal education might have been. And lastly, the build component. This is super crucial, and I think one that often gets really dismissed when people really don't understand abolition, but it's essentially about not waiting on our elected officials to provide us with what we need. We're certainly fighting for changes in those spheres, in those spheres for those things to happen, but we're not putting all our eggs in that basket, right? We're taking it upon ourselves to make the present more survivable for everyone. And we're trying to make those practices more sustainable in our communities. And this can be everything from community fridges, mutual aid efforts that consistently gather needed supplies to keep our houseless community members safe, clothed, warm in the winter, cool in the summer, right? There's so many different ways that we engage in this. And in fact, part of how I think about it as being part of the Academy is when I built the Abolitionist Social Change Collective with my colleagues, that was a building project of seeing something that we needed in a space that was needed that we didn't have. And we now have over 250 members contributing to that beautiful collective, right? So that build component is huge. And that was a very, very quick introduction to PIC abolition, but I'll just end by saying that where social work fits into this is all of the things that I had mentioned, the structural analysis, the ways of intervention, is social work thinking about those things and engaging in that work and committed to that work. Many of us who have long been part of the abolitionist movement would say no, and we see a lot of momentum shifts happening that are really important, and we want to encourage more of that analysis and more of that movement. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the other presentations and Q&A. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarantakos, for your presentation. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Brock-Petroshius. So you can go ahead and get your slides ready. You can, I think you have.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Sophia, for grounding us in such a rich historical, conceptual, theoretical understanding of what we mean by abolition. I am going to focus on this, this piece of the definition of PIC abolition focused on practical organizing strategy. I often joke, I'm a Capricorn, so I like the practical. All right, I think, oops, hold on. Let me redo that because I need to make sure I can share some video in a little bit. All right. So yeah, my name is Kristen Brock-Petroshius. My pronouns are she and her. For a visual description, I'm a white woman who thinks of myself as a femme, even regardless of how other people view me, with medium length brown hair. I have black glasses. I'm wearing a winter cozy sweater and a gray blazer. So before I became a researcher, I spent over a decade doing community organizing around issues of racial justice and abolition. For me, abolition is racial justice, so I often use the words interchangeably. As organizers, we can tell really good stories about the impact of our work, right? It's part of how we motivate people into taking action. But over time, I started to just feel like the political stakes of all the issues going on in the world are too high to not better understand what tactics are effective, how they work, like what do we actually, given like limited time, energy, resources, what ought we, focus on to be able to move the political needle, right? The work is too important to not be strategic. So that's why I went into research. I study community organizing, specifically focused on how do we increase support for racial justice and abolitionist policies. In this talk, I'm going to talk about my research, but in a way that's like research light. So I'm really going to focus on the method of deep canvassing, what we know about its effectiveness, and how it can be a model for imagining social work moving forward. I'll also name, community organizing has always been a core part of social work, even if it's been like a marginalized subfield. And I hope that in the years to come, we see it kind of expand and more of us claim organizing practice as a part of what we do. And organizing is important beyond these somewhat arbitrary bounds of the profession of social work, right? So for me, I want to ground us in understanding that the carceral state is a core race-making force in the United States. It targets Black, Indigenous, or Latinx and poor communities and has devastating impacts. It weakens social ties, captures community and family wealth, creates premature death, and undermines political power. So when we understand the carceral state in this way, dismantling it becomes an essential component to any efforts to eliminate structural racism, right? Racial justice and carceral state cannot coexist. A key question for organizers, scholars, social workers becomes, how do we influence the dominant attitudes that uphold support for the carceral state, right? This is our current status quo. So we need to engage with these questions of how do we shift this? In trying to address this question, the attitudes of white people become a particular concern. As we can see by the shades of green on this map, white people are a majority in 89% of counties in all but 4 states within the US. Even in areas where white people are not the majority, they often hold overly proportionate political power. So in California, for example, where my most recent work has been rooted, non-Latinx white people are 42% of the population, but are 59% of voters. So when we think about political power, like big P political power, votes, the influence people have on politicians and policy outcomes, we got to figure out how to move white people, right? We also know that, for decades, maybe centuries, a lot of people, everyday people, organizers, scholars, psychologists, you name it, have been trying to change people's attitudes about a variety of racial social justice issues, and very little works. The few strategies that have been identified typically decay within days or require lots and lots of interventions, to use our very social work, intervention frame, over months or years. So given the fact that very little works, it stands out that there's one community organizing intervention or tactic that has repeatedly been shown to work. And this is deep canvassing. So deep canvassing focuses on sharing personal stories and making emotional connections about political issues rather than just sharing information, right? Oftentimes, I think especially those of us in higher ed, we tend to think that people just need to better understand. We need to increase knowledge, and that's how change will kind of magically occur. My contention is that knowledge and facts are not enough. Most research has shown like that it doesn't actually, that's not what moves people. So deep canvassing has been shown to reduce transphobia and anti-immigrant xenophobia. In my work, I've shown that it can actually shift carceral attitudes and increase support for anti-carceral policies. The effects of deep canvassing can endure for months and withstand the effects of counter messages. So when we think of these kind of classic examples of local sheriffs doing race bait, fear mongering, saying things like, oh, if we let people out of jail, we're going to have more violence in the community, right? Deep canvassing is so powerful, it can be an antidote to those kinds of tactics. So deep canvassing is clearly a very powerful intervention, and I think social work can play a role in thinking about how we could use it. Deep canvas organizing also can serve as a model for imagining social work futures. How do we target interventions in white communities as those most responsible for the reproduction of structural racism? How do we talk about anti-Black racism in ways that are effective in building support for racial justice and abolitionist policies? And how can we use community organizing and political social work practice to target dominant ideology as a source of power? So I'm going to take a moment to explain and actually show you a real example of a live deep canvas conversation. This video is from our work in Los Angeles over the last few years towards a measure that successfully was passed, diverting 10% of the sheriff's budget away from jails and law enforcement and instead into community resources and alternatives to incarceration. So it's a real successful policy example of this divest invest strategy that Sophia spoke about. For anyone who is recording, I want to ask that this is the beginning of like pause record because I'm about to share a video that is fine for me to share live, but it's vulnerable. So I don't want this to be something that someone can just Google and find on the internet. I think might be helpful. Great. So what you just saw was the first section of this intervention, where the purpose is to introduce the topic, to play survey mode and uncover the person's honest opinion about the topic. You notice, the canvasser was, non-judgmental. They were engaged in active listening, and they're trained to remember the concerns that the person names at this point, not to address them right in this moment. So they're not practicing what we're often taught, that kind of our role and, working towards racial justice is to interrupt whatever we see. It's a little bit more of a strategic, almost like political therapy approach. I like to think of it okay, I'm going to come back to these concerns. I'm going to come back to the things you said that maybe I would think of as maybe problematic, but not right now. We're going to get to that a little bit later. Next, I'm going to show you section 2, sharing personal stories. Here, the purpose is to ask questions about personal experiences and dig deeper to make an emotional connection. And this is where you can pause the recording again. Brief research. Oh, thank you. I'm like forgetting that. So thank you. We're good now. No more video. So this brings me to the very short research part of my presentation, where I did a field experiment on if and how deep canvassing can increase support for anti-carceral policies and change deeper carceral attitudes. I also compared 2 versions of the conversation, one where we talk explicitly about anti-Black racism in the criminal legal system, and another where we do not. In this way, the results can contribute to these active debates and organizing and scholarship about, can we talk about racism and still build support for racial justice abolitionist policies, especially when we're talking with white people. This work was a collaboration with the LA affiliate of Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is White People for Black Lives. And again, these conversations were grounded in the Measure J ballot initiative, which reallocated 10% of the sheriff's budget away from carceral systems into community resources. So in this recent study, which you will not find if you Google it because I'm writing it right now, it's not published, I found a few things. So deep canvassing, it does work to increase support for jail decarceration, at least in the shorter term. Explicitly discussing racism does not decrease support for jail decarceration policies, which is a big deal because most research about this question of like, can we talk about racism, shows that when you talk about it, especially with white people, it undermines support. It creates a backlash effect in trying to advance racial justice policies. So there's something about the way we were doing it in these conversations that was equally as effective. Deep canvassing also was able to increase support for other types of anti-carceral policies that weren't even part of the conversation, such as restoring voting rights for people with felonies or reallocating funding from the police budget into community resources and alternatives to policing. And then lastly, what my study showed is that talking about racism, while whether or not we talk about it is kind of the same in the domain of shifting policy support, it might be the only way to shift underlying ideological attitudes that justify the carceral status quo. So big implications for how we organize, how we create change at the level of communities. And I want to give you an example of what this means practically. So if we were using deep canvassing in a real electoral context, there's a ballot initiative in a county, right? That's typically the scale this is happening in. What difference can deep canvass organizing make? So I'm going to point out, this graph, if you look here at B, this was a policy around offering treatment, mental health or addiction treatment for people in jail. This is a kind of policy that generally has higher levels of support. So for the placebo group, they had, a share of supporters that was like 69%. For those who had the race absent conversation, we were able to increase the share of supporters by 4 percentage points. For those who explicitly had conversations about racism, that bumped up by about 9 percentage points. To give you an example from another kind of policy, this is the policy that's about divesting from policing into alternatives, right? So this very different, generally low levels of support. This is like defunding the police efforts. Even here, we found, a similar, actually, both the placebo and the let's not talk about race conditions had about a 28% share of supporters. So this is likely how people would vote if it's on an election day ballot. But for those who had explicit conversations about racism, the share of supporters bumped up by 5 percentage points. So these are not tiny effects, right? When we think, for any of you who've been engaged in any kind of electoral work, even though we can critique electoral work, it's an important part of the puzzle of how we make broader political shifts. A lot of times elections are decided by a margin of like 1 or 2 percentage points. So what deep canvassing shows here is a potential effect that's at like 4, 5, 8 percentage point changes in vote share, which can change the entire outcome of elections. So this, I really think, can be a strategy that many organizers within and beyond social work ought to consider. So this work, when I think about deep canvas organizing, it's a clear example of how social work can leverage community practice to change policies and structures, right? We know as a discipline, we love interventions. Maybe sometimes we do interventions well, sometimes we don't, but we like to think we do interventions well, right? So this is a way of how to like strategically use that. It's also an example within political social work of how we can not only influence decision makers and electoral outcomes and who is elected, but also how we target ideology as an important dimension of power. This work also shows how we can focus interventions strategically in white communities and with political actors as those most responsible for the reproduction of structural racism, right? So it's really kind of challenging the paradigm of who we do social work with. It's an example of how we can experiment with ways for discussing racism and effectively building support for racial justice and abolitionist policies, rather than be satisfied with often kind of status quo approaches of, well, let's avoid talking about racism out of fear of creating a backlash effect. And then lastly, I think this work is an example of how we can really expand the boundaries of social work and contribute to broader efforts in community organizing more broadly. So I'm also going to reference abolitionist scholar and organizer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I love this quote of hers. She says, in scholarly research, answers are only good as the further questions they provoke, while for activists, answers are only as good as the further tactics they make possible. And that is, really kind of the two prongs that I think, my work and deep canvassing offers social work, right? All towards the aim of supporting our generations long collective work to eliminate structural racism and advance, W.E.B. Du Bois' conception of abolition democracy. So thank you so much for engaging. I'm really excited to pass it to you, Dr. James, and continue the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Dr. Brock-Petroshius and Dr. James, you're up next. You also have slides that you would like to share?
I will.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kristen. That was phenomenal. Thank you, Sophia. Before I begin to share my slides, I think that we have maybe 230 people in a room. And to some of you, this may feel like, a very normal conversation. And to some people, this conversation may feel like very uncomfortable. So a lot of my work is really to ask, as Kristen said, as Sophia said, why are we not having this conversation, for varied reasons. So my work as an abolitionist is to really think about, especially an abolitionist who works in educational spaces, to think about how are we creating a space for people to think more critically about these issues, right? It's not that, in abolition, we want you to just take what it is that we're saying. We really want people to think critically about what we're saying, compare it to what you believe, compare it to what's happening in society, and ultimately make the right decision. So the framework I'm going to show you is a framework that I utilize in educational spaces. It's really centered around creating this idea of brave space, really saying that these conversations are incredibly heavy for a lot of people for various reasons. So the framework that I'm going to utilize, it's a amalgamation, a combination of feminist theory, of my work as a community organizer as well, and also my clinical work, right? Really understanding that these conversations are really triggering for people. They're having an effect on people that is it's chemical, it's biological. So how are we then going to create the space that actually allows people to have these conversations that actually leads to action? So I'm going to start to share in 1 minute. So the framework I work under is Evolve. And the reason why is, as my colleagues have said, really these things are not new. Systems of oppression, systems of harm are as old as the formation and older of this nation, right? This is a nation that was formed in genocide. It's a nation that continues to exploit people, murder people, and kill people. Yet the folks that are incarcerated are folks who predominantly look like me. So I'm not someone who is just an educator or researcher. I'm someone who's directly impacted by a lot of the things that my colleagues have just discussed. We usually look at the 1990s, the crime bill, and the statistics, right? We saw in the 1990s that our prison population went from about 200,000 in the 1970s to almost 2 million people. Most of those people were young Black men, women, people of color. And very few people stop to ask why, right? No one really asks why. And a lot of that has to do with, racism, American racism, right? The idea that Black people are inherently criminal, the idea that people of color are inherently criminal or somehow inferior. So really for me in doing this work, it's really, again, how are we creating the spaces that afford people to really sit with these tensions and begin to ask the why? So the framework I'm going to share, it's called BIG. And maybe to kind of give context to this, right? Just because someone I may use the word abolitionist and anti-oppressive practitioner or anti-oppressive praxis, which I think are all for me the same thing, right? Which is working towards the creation of a world in which people can actualize free of harm, right? Reimagining systems that don't work and really creating systems that do work for people. So just because I identify as an abolitionist or an anti-oppressive practitioner, it doesn't mean that I've reached some promised land. It doesn't mean that I am, like not faults. I don't have faults or I'm not creating harm for myself. And so much of my work as an abolitionist, as an anti-oppressive practitioner, has been rooted in the last few years in educational spaces. So the framework that I'm about to share really comes from like me failing, me really struggling. I think one of the things about like abolition is this idea of like praxis, really theory, like what is a theory that we're operating under, our ability to reflect, and act, right? And not these things aren't linear, but like really seeing these things as a process. So after I messed up really badly in the class, I went back and I really said, there must be an easier way, right? Like we're asking people to have this lift. This conversation for many people, it's probably a lift. It's probably very heavy, right? If you don't have proximity to these issues. And I felt like we weren't really warming people up. We weren't preparing them. So BIG for me is like the 3 commandments of abolitionist praxis. And I'm going to explain what this means. And again, this is a theory. This is, a way that I utilize to, set up my classes, to set up my trainings, any type of anti-oppressive space that I'm utilized. It's a framework that actually I use in my personal life, in all aspects of my personal life. So normally, again, like in doing this work, I really feel like it's important to be trauma informed. I really feel like it's important to have joy. So, to really diffuse a space, I often ask like, who's your favorite rapper? And, all types of things start to come, people start to argue. And then I'm like, why? How can you prove that, right? And this is like really what we're asking. Like, why is America a democracy? Like, why do you believe that? Why do you believe abolition is radical? Because we're asking for like a world in which, scarcity doesn't exist. My colleague told you how much money is being spent on war, how much money is being spent to really create havoc around the world. Why can't we put this money back in societies? Why can't we put this money back in education? Why can't we put this money in housing? So this is what abolition is. Abolition is asking us to like really reimagine the world. And these are tools that, for me, I feel have been incredibly helpful in creating spaces with people to begin that reimagination. So one of the first things I feel is that I really believe in the power of liberatory education. Like, I don't think any of these things are happening accidental. I think the reason why a lot of people don't check into these things that we're talking about is because you weren't educated to, right? Like you weren't like taught that, slavery didn't stop, right? You didn't realize, you weren't taught about like the genocides that took place. So it's really important, I feel, for us to really consider like what it means, to engage in liberatory education. And bell hooks, speaks about, liberatory education can only happen if it's a field that we all labor in, meaning we all have to be willing to put in like work. But we know that like labor is discomfort, labor is difficult. So many people, again, don't engage in these conversations because it's difficult. Like people like check out, right? And it's almost like, they're telling us it's too heavy. And we wouldn't go to the gym and just start with something like really heavy. We would begin with a warm-up process. So for me, like BIGs, again, it's a way to warm up people to engage in like critical education that leads to action. So commandment number 1 is we must acknowledge and dismantle bias. So much of, again, what we're talking about is really like bias. We're talking about a country that hasn't really allowed us to think critically. So I often start, when I'm in a liberatory space, I ask of people, I ask of myself, like, how do you know what you know? And like, who benefits? Really, this comes from the work of liberatory theorist Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where Paulo Freire says there's no such thing as a neutral educational process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system, and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes a practice of freedom. So, when you think about this quote for a minute, right, there is no such thing as a neutral educational process. If some of the things that Sophia mentioned, some of the things Kristen mentioned, if you went to school and you were told these things, would you pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States? So again, there is no such thing as a neutral educational process. Bell Hooks takes this further when she talks about the banking system of education, a process, where students, all they need to do is consume information fed to them, memorize it and store it, and then regurgitate it, right? And then told that they're smart. You're smart for memorizing history and facts, which serve to maintain the oppression, which is the United States. So bell hooks and Freire go on to say that, like in liberatory education, it's not just a transference of information. We must be willing to create conscientization, translating that term to critical awareness. Critical awareness can only happen when we're all showing up to question, when we're all showing up to respect each other's humanity and really believing that there can be something better than what we have right now. So, in liberatory spaces, I think it's just really important for us all to acknowledge that we have bias, right? It's not that some of us have bias. If we think of white supremacy as like the root to much of this bias we're talking about, then we have to understand that it's a disease, it's a disease that's infected like everyone. There's no like hue, color. We really have to see like white supremacy and oppression as a disease that is highly infectious. The thing too with combating bias, right? So it's not just like we have bias, right? Like everyone can be like, okay, I have bias. But the thing is, our minds are wired to like maintain that bias. We're wired to kind of like have cognitive consistency, meaning we're wired to believe the things we've been taught to believe. So, when Sophia or Kristen is doing a study and are asking people about like race and giving them other thoughts, they're going to be like, no, I don't believe that. They're going to push back on that because it's creating cognitive dissonance. And Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth and other really powerful books, talks about this idea of cognitive dissonance. He says sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with that core belief. That feels like the history of America, right? It feels like exactly where we're at right now, this idea that America has been somehow great. America has never been great, but people have been told it's great, right? And then all of a sudden here come, these radical folks saying like, hey, we need to check into this. And they're all experiencing cognitive dissonance. They're like, no, we ain't trying to hear that. So, like combating bias and combating dissonance is really important in this work, right? To be abolitionist, to be anti-oppressive, to reimagine our world. A really great tool to combat bias and dissonance is just really why. I found why to be one of the most powerful cognitive disruptors, right? And it may not always like take place in the moment, but you've planted a seed. You have to understand that so much of like racism, sexism, oppression, it happens in talk in silos. People are all saying the same thing. Nobody questions these things. We're all educated. As a man, I understand how sexism is pervasive around me to the point that I don't even like think about it, right? It's not till somebody may say to me like, why do you believe that way? Why do you think that? And I'm like, okay, you know what? I didn't even realize that. So why can be a really powerful disruptor in not only for ourselves, right, but really for others. Always being willing to ask the why. I think of abolition as being perpetually curious. So again, the first commandment is bias, just a recognition that we all have some level of bias. So if we all realize that we have some level of bias in this work, right, to be anti-oppressive, to create a different world, then like, what's our intention? We talk a lot about like the importance of values in this work, but I often don't feel like our values are in play when we're uncomfortable. So, when I'm in space with people, I'm like, okay, if we understand we have bias, right? what is our intention? Is our intention to learn? Is it to grow, or simply have our beliefs reaffirmed? It's really important to ask people that, right? Because we're in a world right now where there's so many people committed to having their beliefs reaffirmed. And if so, then you understand where they're at and you should move accordingly. But for people that are saying that, like we're really in this to create a better world, then it's so important for us to really be clear with that intention. It's really important that we're understanding that with that commitment is going to bring a lot of struggle, because unpacking, decolonization, whatever it is we want to call it, is not going to be easy. So the thing that's going to really guide us is our intention. A tool for me when I think about intention is like this concept of North Star. And, I don't know how true it is or not, but, like back in the days, they always said the North Star is like the brightest star in the sky, right? So the way I think of this is like, when it's dark, what is going to guide you? Because when you're being asked to see yourself more critically, when you're being asked to challenge systems more critically, a lot of that work is going to feel like really lonely. A lot of that work may feel like really dark, but you're going to have a North Star. You're going to have something that guides you and sustains you in this work. And for me, my North Star is this quote by Malcolm X, which I really love. And he says, "I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who is it for or against. I'm a human being, first and foremost. And as such, I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole." So, if we're for truth, justice, and humanity, yet recognize our own bias, like really, how do we evolve? So this brings us to our last piece, right? Because I think the work to be anti-oppressive, the work to be abolitionist, there is no mountaintop. It's a continuous process. It's a continuous process of engagement on micro levels, on macro levels, on meso levels, right? So then the thing is, what is going to guide that engagement? What's going to guide that engagement if we understand that we have bias? What's going to guide that engagement that honors our values? And for me, that is like the co-creation of ground rules. And ground rules are essentially like a social contract, a way in which we're going to collectively engage in this work. And when I think about ground rules, right, the irony is that our Constitution is a social contract. And yet our Constitution, though, was created by white men for white men. So the idea of like co-creating a new social contract is a must, like for the people and by the people. So how are we going to do this in smaller spaces till we have a larger social contract that represents the people? And this for me is like really ground rules. Another thing about ground rules is like we have to really see this as living documents, right? And Thomas Jefferson, again, who was one of the architects of our current Constitution for white men by white men, said, that if we don't see our social contract as a living document, it will imprison future generations. And here we are, imprisoned by a social contract for white men by white men. So it's so important that, again, that like we're practicing, within our spaces, within our liberatory communities, ground rules, social contracts, and we're seeing this thing as a living document. One of the first things when I think of a social contract is just really like this commitment to one humanity. When you think about the history of abolition, abolition wasn't Black. Abolition was like human beings, was Black people, white people, Native folks, right? Really people understanding that, a system of oppression to one is a system of oppression to another. So I think it's so important that as people, our first social contract is just a commitment to one humanity. And this is a little Anne Watson quote that I really like. And it really, for me, is like the abolitionist spirit. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your salvation is bound up with mine, then let us walk together. It's this idea of like intersectionality, a feminist principle, right? It's this idea of like one humanity. So these are some examples for me, like in some spaces that I utilize, like just really committing to vulnerability. Really vulnerability is really important in this work. My colleagues like spoke really honestly and openly about the genocide taking place in Israel right now, in Gaza right now, I should say, right? And a lot of people are not willing to do that. A lot of people are not willing in a profession that is dedicated to, anti-oppression and speaking truth. Like, we're not even having these conversations in our spaces, right? There is no conversation around what is happening in Gaza right now. So really just committing to a process of vulnerability and honesty, committing to, like, we can do that. I can be 100% real and be respectful of you as a human being. I'm really committed to using like mindful language. Really even being intentional in how I show up, right? And I think this is such a big part of the work, is that we're all in spaces that we're also taxed. If I'm taxed and I don't have the ability to even self-regulate, I can't show up to a critical conversation. I'm not going to show up and like engage in like restorative actions or like anti-oppressive work, because I can't. So it's so important that we create like, social contract and community agreements that really guide how we're going to show up in what is going to be challenging work, right? This is not easy work. I despite the word safe space, right? Like, this has to be brave space. We have to really be courageous if we're ever going to dismantle these systems of oppression. So, again, bringing in like the trauma work that I do as well, I think about, so how do people sit in these conversations? And again, we have to be trauma informed, because, discomfort triggers trauma, right? And trauma impacts our window of tolerance. And our window of tolerance is simply like our ability to sit and hear what it is that is being said, no matter how difficult it is. And, if we're not aware of our window of tolerance, then sometimes maybe already some of you are checked out, right? People are like, yo, I can't wait to tell him about himself. Or somebody's like, you know what? I'm just going to begin to do my Amazon shopping right now, right? So like, a window of tolerance is really our ability to sit with difficult conversations. And as a community that is dedicated to this work, it's so important that like we're naming this, right? Like, oppression is trauma. Like, these are all like, we're talking about hundreds of years of oppression. This isn't like one act, right? We're talking about hundreds of years of oppression. And we're also talking about a level of oppression, a level of trauma that has never been posed. Racial oppression, economic oppression, gender oppression. None of these things have ever been posed, right? These things are perpetual. There is no analysis for this level of harm. So the reality is that we're all showing up in these spaces with some level of trauma and are often going to get triggered. So if we're not, again, trauma informed and really setting into our window of tolerance, then this is going to create drama in us, right? This is going to create drama in our brains. It's going to disrupt our corpus callus, which allows for holistic thinking, right? So our ability to think critically is going to be disrupted. This is going to have an effect in our bodies. I think most diseases, I think most sicknesses are a byproduct of the stress that we live under in this world. So again, it's so important that we are trauma informed. And I'm going to wrap up, because this is Friday, right? And really just this idea of like taking care of ourselves as like liberatory, right? Again, we are the instruments of our liberation. I think about when my research professor used to say, like, what's the efficacy of your instrument? Meaning, like, what's the ability for your instrument to do what it is that you intended to do? Well, in the work to be anti-oppressive, in the work to be liberatory, in the work to be abolitionist, we are the instruments of our liberation. So if we recognize that we are all living in a traumatic world and we are constantly inundated with trauma, with stress, with genocide, with all of these things, then our ability to take care of ourselves, our ability to be restorative, is a necessity for us to show up and do this work. So thank you all very much. For me, BIG allows us to intentionally create brave space. I believe brave space allows us to have more discussions like this that leads actually to action.
Thank you so much, Jay. I appreciate your presentation, and thank you to all of our presenters for such amazing presentations today. It looks like, so just to remind the audience members, if you have a question for the presenters, please enter them into the using the Q&A function. I am going to ask, I think the first one of the a couple of questions that we have here. This one is from Kate, who has a question for you. Kristen, I hope it's okay to use your first names. I've been bothering the three of you so much lately. I feel like we're practically family. And this is regarding, so you mentioned the short-term changes regarding your deep canvassing approach. Are there data on the long-term changes? And are these results for changes from beginning to end of deep canvassing conversation? And is there data upon follow-up? I was going to ask you about when we can expect to see the paper, but that could be anxiety-inducing, so I'll leave that one alone. But what about some of the longer term?
So without getting too into the weeds of the research design, the measures were taken not at the point of the conversation. So they were totally independent. People thought they were taking a UCLA survey. They didn't know it was actually about deep canvassing. So 1 week out is the short term. So a week after, like, yes, the policy shifts were there. After that, I also measured 2 months later, 6 months later. There it becomes a bit more of a nuanced, complex story. Some of the effects continued that long, some of them decayed. But what did persist were these deeper ideological shifts when we talked explicitly about racism.
Okay. I think let me see. Looks like there's another question. As a social worker who was in the past was working with individuals coming out of prison, how can we best help our clients when they are denied housing or can't find jobs due to illiteracy, limited funds? Chorus. Any thoughts about helping formerly incarcerated individuals?
I can jump in really quickly. I think, it's really, being able to develop numerous networks, right? There's not going to be like one answer. I think we have to really be creative in thinking about like how are we supporting folks around like their mental health, their health, trying to identify, any family resources. I think really seeing if the family can be a resource. Really, I think it's such a complicated, to put it in context, right? I mean, 600,000 people are released every year. And research tells us that, a good portion of them end up back in jails and prisons because of the lack of resources. So I think what actually works is really just creating a holistic web of sources. Each city is going to look a little bit different. If you're in New York City, there's there's NYC Connects, which is published by the library, which has incredibly amount of resources. I think each city will probably have some degree of reentry resources. But again, you have to see it as really holistic. It's not, just housing. It's not just jobs. It's really trying to provide, a really holistic level of care. And it's honestly, it's one of the hardest things right now, right? Because a lot of the issues that actually are the challenges for people post-prison were the challenges before prison, right? That are now being exacerbated. So I think we also need to say that.
That's great. Any thoughts from Sophia or Kristen as well?
Just echo all of Jay's thoughts. Absolutely.
Yeah. And on a more meta level, I'll add that, some of, I think, the best deep canvassers in LA were people who were working as social workers in juvenile justice camps, in carceral institutions. And then they saw it as like, by day I'm working within the system, and in the evenings and weekends, like I'm working to dismantle it. So there is a bit of a part of we have to work within it and care for people, but we also need to find ways to work to dismantle it as well. And that often, maybe sometimes, but often that's not going to be part of our paid work.
Yeah, let me see. I don't think there are any other, let me see if I can find another question. But I have one that you probably hear a lot. Let me see. Okay, here's another question. I feel like many social workers are told to refrain from anything considered political, and that now has become the buzz term for anything uncomfortable. I wonder how we normalize political involvement and engagement as a part of social work practice so that this field can truly engage in racial equity and abolitionist work? Who wants to go first?
That's a big question. Well,
Absolutely.
I think Jay's presentation in particular spoke really powerfully and beautifully to that. I think maybe some things I would add, right? Like he mentioned, and I see the comment here around Israel and Palestine, right? It's like we are in a time right now of very deep misinformation campaigns, and I'm not relating this exactly to Israel and Palestine. I'm talking about the broader culture that we live in of anti-intellectualism, misinformation campaigns, and people really fighting against what is historical truth and historical accuracy. And I think for me, right, like, I would argue there is no such thing, that there's anything that's apolitical. Nothing. There is nothing that's apolitical. Everything is related to, how we move our bodies, how we show up in the world, like everything deeply political. And so when we avoid that, we're not telling the truth. And we're starting off in a very dishonest place. And so we certainly can't be involved in social change work in an apolitical way. I don't even know what that means, because everything, whether people are explicit about their values or not, the values are there, their worldviews are there, and their politics are there. It's just that some of us are more explicit about it than others. And so I don't even really know what that means. And I would say that what we need more of is grounding ourselves in historical truth, in historical accuracy, in actual information, and sitting, like Jay said, with that discomfort of what the truth tells us. There is a truth about the history. It's not conjecture. It's not one side has one story that's okay and another side has another story. There is an actual factual truth. And we need to sit in the muck of that truth and how heavy that feels. And if we don't do that, we're not doing social work, is what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think, can I say something really quickly to that
Sure.
too? Thank you, Sophie. I think there's a part of this where our values have become like really lost. If you look at like social work values, right, it is to do this work, but we're not doing this work, right? And I think for the people that are like pushing it, we have become the minority in this field. But what Sophia said is so true, right? It's like we can't there's a practice that I really believe in. It's the practice of Sankofa, where the bird is often like looking back over its shoulder. It's a West African practice, and it says to really understand where we are and to understand where we're going, we have to go back and look at our history. There is no way that we can talk about what's happening in the United States, what's happening in the Middle East. There's nowhere, anywhere without actually rooting that in a historical perspective. If we do that, that is like, that's oppressive. That's oppression. So I think like that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, but you have to be willing to be uncomfortable. This work is going to be uncomfortable. Decolonize is going to be uncomfortable. And I think we need to say that to people, because if we're not, then it's like we're going to lose an opportunity.
Thank you so much for that. So I think we have time for one more question that it looks like I missed. Just briefly, and this is for anyone. I wonder, what are your thoughts? What your thoughts are about reforming the broken system versus organized revolution?
I mean, I'm going to be quick. I don't think any of us here are for reform. I think like we all understand that the system has to be changed. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I do think though that there is something really important, even as an abolitionist. I think it's really important that we work in the middle, right? So like we have to really figure out how to make these systems safer for people that are in jails and prisons, till we are ultimately able to not transform them, but to blow them up, right? And to create a different system. And I think that's often a tension for people. I'm not for reform in any of these systems. They're doing exactly what they've been intended to do, which is to oppress and destroy, and to exploit people of color, right? So that's their ethos. So I think the only way we can do is do away with them. But the question is, it's like, what do we do till we get to that point? And I think that's also a very important conversation.
Thank you. Thank you again. So we're out of time now. So thank you, audience members, for for engaging with us and for submitting your questions. Thanks again to the presenters. I learned so much today. All of your presentations were amazing. Thank you for joining us. I do have a script. I have a few more things that I would like to say before I officially close out. Please watch for all the audience members. Please watch for an email with the link to complete an evaluation on today's presentation, and watch for a separate email regarding CEUs for those that requested them when they registered. Also, we hope to see you next week on February 2nd for part 2 of this conference. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thanks again to our presenters. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.